Mark chapter 4, end of the chapter. It's a long chapter, 41 verses or so. This is an account that has always been very precious to me. It identifies so closely with this passage in so many ways, and I know you will as well. It's one of those that really challenges us to look at Jesus, to consider the significance of his person, his identity as God, and how many times we need that. God puts us in these positions so many times as he put his disciples in different ways just to get us to look at him. I'm convinced he does that in our life. And so we're going to look at that this morning. Look, if you will, at verse 35 down to verse 41. Read a very familiar account. It says this: "And the same day when the evening was come, he said unto them," that is his disciples, "Let us pass over unto the other side. And when they had sent away the multitude, they took him even as he was in the ship. And there were also with him other little ships." A neat little comment that Mark puts in there. It says, "And there arose a great storm of wind, and the waves beat into the ship, so that it was now full. And he was in the hinder part of the ship, asleep on a pillow, and they awake him, and say unto him, Master, carest thou not that we perish? And he arose and rebuked the wind, and said unto the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said unto them, Why are ye so fearful? How is it that you have no faith? And they feared exceedingly, and said one to another, What manner of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" Very probing passage of Scripture. I don't know if I would want to have experienced this, to be quite frank and honest with you, but we are so thankful that we have this recorded, because what we have recorded here, folks, is so true to life, it isn't even funny, to be honest with you. It may not be the specific instance that the disciples faced, but we face things very similar. And I'm praying, and I'm hoping that this Sunday school will be somewhat devotional in some respects, but also challenging to your faith. Start with a little bit of a story. I probably have shared this with some of you before, but when I was in graduate school, in fact, I was already married, I was eating, I think it was dinner at the dining common at Bob Jones's campus, and it was in the summertime, if I'm not mistaken. I was sitting across the table from my wife, and there was a group of people about 3 tables down from us that was sitting there eating, and I noticed, looking at the back of this girl, that there was a coworker of mine sitting there, and her name was Tracy. I'd worked with Tracy for, a year and a half at that point, knew her well, and I told my wife, I said, "Hey, Tracy's over there." And so we kept talking. Well, my wife and I, we finished the meal. And at the end of that, I thought, well, I'm going to stop by the table and say hello to Tracy. And, of course, her back was to me. And I thought I'll make a grand hello to her, because I'll just kind of surprise her and shock her. And so I picked up my tray and walked by the table. When I did, I stuck my head over the table. I said, "Hello!" And it wasn't Tracy. I have no idea who this girl was, but from the back it looked like Tracy, but it wasn't Tracy. And I was a little bit embarrassed by it. And I was like, I said, "I'm sorry, I thought you were someone else." And of course, I'm sure my wife got a good chuckle out of that. And after the girl was non-startled anymore, she kind of chuckled at that as well. And I moved on. And you say, "Why are you telling this story?" Well, you know what it is to get in places in life where you get embarrassed and you do something, and it's kind of after the fact, you go, "Why in the world did I do that? Why did I respond that way or act that way?" And I'm sure you probably have stories that way. Well, the neat thing about Scripture is that when the disciples wrote the gospel accounts, they included those accounts as well that I would guess normally would be embarrassing to them. This is one of those, I think, that's like that. When Mark writes his gospel, most scholars are convinced that the apostle behind Mark is the apostle Peter. And of course, if you know Peter, he's always putting his foot in his mouth. He's always doing something a little bit dumb, if you will, it seems like. And what's amazing to me is Peter does not attempt to cover that up. It's right there. He's transparent with you. He's saying, this is what happened. This is what I've done. Yes, it's embarrassing, but God wanted to use that in my life, and he wants to use these kinds of things in your life as well. And what we have, I do believe, is an account here that on the one hand, humanly speaking, you would understand why he responds the way he responds. But on the other hand, you would go, that's a little bit embarrassing the way Peter responds, and the other disciples as well. Well, I'm thankful the Bible includes those things, because, folks, those are the things that God often uses to challenge us, to cause us to think, to really reflect upon where we are in our relationship to the Lord. And so while this account may be somewhat embarrassing to the disciples, at the same time, I think it was one of those moments where their faith grew several notches in the Lord as well. So we have here, folks, A marvelous account. You say, well, what's the purpose behind Mark? Well, simply this. It's to convince you that this man, Jesus, truly is God. In fact, if you go back to Mark 1, I believe it's verse 1, he talks about this being the gospel of Jesus Christ, and then it adds the Son of God. And that would have been big, because Mark was actually writing his gospel to more of the Gentile world. And he's trying to convince the Gentile world that this man Jesus, who lived in Palestine, who lived in the nation of Israel, truly is the Son of God. He is very God of very God. And this is one of those accounts that's really strengthening that conclusion for the disciples and should strengthen it for us as well. So an embarrassing moment perhaps in the disciples' response, because you'll find here that they get into a circumstance in verse 40, Jesus says they have no faith. None at all in this situation. You ever get in those situations, men and women, where you say, I really am a person of faith, but in this instance, I have no faith. I'm responding as if I'm completely faithless. Well, sometimes we do that, and those are the moments I think God works in powerful ways in our lives. So let's get into the account to this morning. And forgive me, my sinuses are actually bothering me a little bit today. I was outside last night for a while, and I don't know if in the grass or where I was, but my fall allergies are kicking in just a little bit today. So, verse 35, it says this. It says, and the same day, I want to pause with this, and I'm just going to walk us through this passage. The same day. You say, what went on that day? Apparently Mark is pointing this out for us. He wants us to really focus on this. What happened on this day? Well, there's a little bit of a debate about how long this day was. No doubt, you go back to the beginning of the chapter, it at least began at the beginning of Mark chapter 4. It says, he began to teach by the seaside, and there was gathered unto him a great multitude, so that he entered into a ship and sat in the sea, and the whole multitude was by the sea and on the land. You say, well, what took place that day? Apparently, this was a very busy day of teaching for Jesus. In fact, it was so big, and we don't know exactly where on the Sea of Galilee Jesus is, whether it's the northern region or maybe on the eastern side of the Sea of Galilee, but somewhere, I'm guessing he actually was probably on the eastern side, maybe, but somewhere near the Sea of Galilee, there was this great multitude. Jesus wants to teach the crowds, and as he often does, he starts teaching about the kingdom of God. And he's going to talk about the parable of the soils. You can see it there, the parable of the lamp. He'll talk about the parable of the growing seed, the parable of the mustard seed. It's a busy day, and my guess is this is just representative of Jesus' teaching. My guess is he taught many times throughout the day, or much throughout the day. And so, Jesus has already had a busy day of teaching. But there are some people, and I'm kind of in this category, who thinks that Jesus' day did not start there. You say, why is that? Because if you compare the gospel accounts, it appears that Jesus had spent the previous night, perhaps, all night in prayer. I'm not quite certain of that, but it's very possible he did that frequently. And what we discover is it's very possible Jesus has actually been up for close to 2 days now. That he's been so busy with what the Lord had him to do, and he's been up in prayer all night, and now this day he's busy teaching. Jesus has had a very, very busy day. And so when Mark starts this account and it says, "and the same day," he wants you to know that Jesus' day has been extremely busy, and he's overwhelmed and tired. And what's going to happen on this day, folks, is Jesus is going to send a test, not for him necessarily, but for his disciples, because let me tell you something, the disciples were tired as well. Now, they might not have spent all night in prayer like Jesus, but they've had a long day as well. There's been crowd control things he's had to do, no doubt. They've been listening to the teaching, perhaps other responsibilities they have had as well. They're tired as well. It's the end of the day. And it says here in verse 35, when evening was come. And that word evening could actually mean anywhere from the afternoon to dark time, or more around dusk into the nighttime. And based on the story, it appears it was more like dusk. The sun's setting, it's getting dark, and now Jesus has something that he wants his disciples to do. What is that? Verse 35 again. He said, "Let us pass over unto the other side." Let's go over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And the speculation has always asked, why? Well, we don't know. We know when Jesus gets there, in chapter 5, there's going to be the devils cast into the swine. He's going to meet a demoniac who's infested with demons, and he's going to cast them out. Obviously, that was a divine appointment by his Father in heaven. We don't know if Jesus intended to do that in the sense of he knew that's what he was going to do. Some speculate that it's been busy. He's had 2 full days. He wanted to get away for a break. He often did that from time to time. Maybe that's what he was doing. We don't know for sure. What we do know is his disciples get on the ship, and they do so obeying Jesus. I think that's important. Because, folks, what's going to happen is a big test is going to arise, and what we're going to discover is Jesus designed this test. These disciples were obeying Jesus as they got into the ship. And sometimes, men and women, we get into situations in life where a test comes. We would call it a storm of life. And it's not because we've done anything wrong. We're obeying Jesus. We're doing what we're supposed to be doing, fulfilling our responsibilities to what God has called us to. But Jesus allows us to get in the boat. He says, get in the boat. You go, okay, I'm getting in the boat. And we start off across the water. You say, well, what happened when they start off across the water? Well, it says in verse 36, and when they had sent away the multitude, they took Jesus even as he was in the ship. That makes you think back of earlier in the chapter where Jesus was on this ship teaching all day. It may be, folks, that he hadn't been out of this ship all day long. Maybe they rowed out some food to him. Maybe they drank some water. Maybe he came back to the shore for lunch and rowed back out for more teaching. And here he is. He's on this ship. You say, well, what was this ship like? We don't really know. But I do think it's interesting that, and I'll just give you a little history here. Back in 1986, there had been a severe drought in the northern region of Galilee in Israel for a couple of years, and the water line had receded from the shoreline, and they actually found a couple of amateur archaeologists, if you will, were walking along the shoreline, and they saw what looked like the outline of a hull of a ship. And sure enough, they started digging and realized that what they had here was an ancient ship that had been buried in the mud and the muck of the Sea of Galilee, and a huge effort went underway to resurrect the ship. And it was time was pressing because it had started to rain, and the water was actually coming back up to the shoreline, and it was a real frantic effort to get this ship up and out of the shoreline. Of course, they had some problems with that because it was old, it had been waterlogged, and it was falling apart. And they went through this whole process. It was kind of neat. This whole process of encasing this ancient ship in some of a foam material so they could actually sell it across the Sea of Galilee, or at least tow it across the Sea of Galilee, to actually work on preserving the ship. And today, if you visit Israel, you can go to this museum, and it'll be funny to you, the whole museum is centered on that resurrected little boat. It's the whole thing. You go in, it's a little small museum. I've been there, a little small museum, and the centerpiece of the whole museum, and it's a small little place, is this boat they resurrected. You say, why did they restore it and put a museum around it? Because as they started to study it, they realized the building techniques that were used were known to have existed around the time of the first century. Maybe a few decades before, maybe a few decades after, but right in this time period. The ship itself was something like 24 and a half feet long, I think 7.5 feet wide, and maybe 4.5 feet tall. So it gives you a little bit of a mental picture of how big this ship. And they say it probably could have held up to about 15 people or so. So it would have very much been like the ship Jesus was on with his disciples as they're sailing across this Sea of Galilee. And they were sailing, by the way. Luke's account in Luke chapter 8 tells us the word it uses is the idea of they unfurled the sails and they went sailing across the ocean or the Sea of Galilee. Now, that's a little context. I want you to think of that for just a moment. Here are the disciples, 12 of them plus Jesus. They're in this little boat, 24.5 feet long, 7.5 feet wide, 4.5 feet tall. Not a huge ship, big enough to have a sail perhaps. Caught the wind, nice pleasant ride. End of the day, evening time. My guess it probably felt pretty nice. Relaxing. Here they are going across the Sea of Galilee. But what else do you know about the Sea of Galilee? Yeah. You wait 10 minutes for the Sea of Galilee and conditions change, right? And they know this. To this day, this still is true. The Sea of Galilee is, I believe, the lowest freshwater lake, according to sea level, in the world. It's not the lowest lake, but it is the lowest freshwater lake in the world. The Sea of Galilee. Yeah, let's say the Dead Sea. The Dead Sea is not a freshwater lake. All right, the Sea of Galilee. And what they know about the Sea of Galilee, because of the topography and the geography, is it sits very low in a valley surrounded by mountains. Both on the western side, the eastern side, the northern side, it's in a little bowl, a little valley. And what happens by the weather is these winds are often very unpredictable, especially the cold winds that come out of the northeast, and they come through the mountain areas, and they come down in that valley, and they hit the warmer weather, and it starts frothing up. A windstorm is what often happens, and it starts frothing the Sea of Galilee. And if you can believe this, it's not a very large lake, by the way. Sea of Galilee is only about 13 miles long. It's about 8 miles wide. It's not a huge lake. But if you can believe this, the storms get so bad that the waves can get up to about 5 to 10 feet tall on a freshwater lake. Now, you expect that out in the ocean, right? I mean, you got huge storms out in the ocean, but this is a small little lake, and that's how big it is. Okay? Can you imagine going out fishing, and the wind comes up, and all of a sudden, not very quickly, you're facing 5-foot waves? That would be concerning. And these men knew that because a lot of these men were fishermen, right? Peter was a fisherman, James, Andrew, probably at least 4 to 5, maybe up to 7 of them were fishermen. So they knew this lake pretty well. And I'm sure when they set sail that night, they thought to themselves, pleasant evening, it's been a long day, I'm going to enjoy the breeze, going to get across, I don't know how many miles they were going, 3 or 4 miles. I imagine it was kind of a pleasure cruise, if you will, thinking this will just be great, we can relax. And they're probably 2 to 3 miles into this thing, and this storm arises. And folks, it says in verse 36, and there were also with them little ships. In other words, they weren't by themselves out here. We forget this detail. There were other people facing the same storm. I'm going to make a little note of that. Sometimes we get into little storms in life, and we think we're the only one there. Well, for whatever reason, Mark puts that little detail in here. I do not know why it's there, but I think a point we can make of it is we're not the only one facing the storm. And sometimes when we get into the storm of life, we sometimes think to ourselves, I'm out here by myself all along. No, folks, there are other people facing storms around you as well. And for whatever reason, Mark puts that detail in there. I think we need to make note of that. But it does say, verse 37, there arose a great storm of wind. And these 5-10-foot waves, however big they were, they're beating into the ship. And folks, let me just give you a little insight. That word storm is used of the idea of a hurricane. The Greek word that's there actually has the idea of a hurricane. So I don't know what the category of hurricanes and the wind speed should be, but I think you should think maybe category 2 hurricane. I don't know how fast are the winds there, 70-mile-an-hour winds, something like that. Little boat out there. In fact, Luke tells us, I think it is, their lives were in jeopardy. They were in danger. Now, how would you like those situations? Like to be in that situation? I don't think a single one of us want to be out in a little boat like that in the middle of the lake, and here comes a hurricane-force winds. Waves are 5-10 feet high. You're in a boat full of 13 grown men, so there's nowhere to go. I mean, all right. You know, sometimes you can have too many people to try to help out, right? You're just falling over one another. I don't know if it felt that way on the boat. I'm sure some of those guys were not professional fishermen. Some of them didn't know what they were doing. So you probably had that dynamic involved as well. Now, verse 37, it says, so that it was now full. There's so much water. They're taking on water. They can't bail out fast enough. They may not have had hardly anything to bail the water out. I don't know. But they're filling up with water. This doesn't look good. Now, have you ever been in that place in life? You say, well, not this kind of place. No, not this kind of place. But have you ever been in somewhere like that where it felt that way to you? The wind is blowing. The circumstances look dire. The diagnosis comes in. You're not sure what's going to happen. Your boat's filling up with water. There's panic that's taking place. We'll see the panic in just a moment. You ever feel that way? Yeah. God, now why are you there? Well, you weren't there because it was your fault. The disciples weren't there because it was their fault. They were just obeying Jesus. They were just getting in the boat, just doing just going along with life, doing what Jesus wanted them to do. Not their fault. So why are they there? You tell me, why are they there? Because Jesus wanted them there. Did you know, folks, Jesus will put you in situations like that in life? And it's not your fault, and you're there because Jesus wants you there. You say, Jesus will do that to me. He will do that to you, men and women. You got to reckon with this Jesus. He will put you in those places in life. Say, why? Because He wants to see, and He already knows, but He wants you to see, I should say it that way, He wants you to see what's going to come out of your heart. What comes out of the heart of these men? Look at it, verse 38. It says, and Jesus was in the hinder part, the end of the ship, the back of the ship. He's asleep on a pillow. You want to talk about being exhausted? You've got waves, wind, water crashing into your boat. I would think you have to agree he's sleeping in water is what's happening here. This is how exhausted Jesus is. It's one of the reasons why I think Jesus had probably spent the previous night in prayer and had a busy day beforehand. He is so wasted in exhaustion. Nothing's waking him up. You say, do people get that wasted life? Yeah, they can. They can get so tired that you think yourself, a train could come through this living room and that man is not going to wake up, right? I mean, he's just so tired. That's where Jesus is right now. But I love what happens with the disciples. It says in verse 38, they wake him. And that's putting it mildly. I really think they wake him. Say, how do they wake him? Well, it says, they say unto him, Master, that is ruler. The idea is you're the one in charge, master. And it could mean teacher as well. That word teacher also means that. Master is used that way in Scripture. Teacher, carest thou not that we perish? I love the question. Don't you care what's going on with me? Don't you? And by the way, if you investigate Matthew's account and Luke's account, they're all saying a little bit different things. They're all, in one sense, it's almost like a prayer that they ask Jesus. This one's an accusation. It's just this, don't you care what's going on with me? I mean, you don't care at all. And the idea is they see Jesus asleep and they think Jesus has no idea what's going on. No idea what's going on. Doesn't know what danger they're in. Okay, you ever make that accusation toward Jesus? You ever go, hey, I'm in the middle of this, and I don't know where Jesus is right now. He must be asleep somewhere, but he doesn't seem to care at all what's taking place in my life. You ever have those thoughts? Nobody's willing to admit it. I have those thoughts. Jesus, don't you know what's going on? Don't you know what I'm facing? Here's my boat. It's filling up. Sorry, my sinuses are really bothering me. It's filling up. Don't you care? Wow. That's a lot of accusation to throw at Jesus. That's a heavy accusation to throw at Jesus. But that's what these disciples thought. So it says in verse 39 that Jesus arose. Now, I don't know. I try to replay these scenes in my mind. But do you know how it is when you wake up and you're exhausted? Do you ever feel out of it when you wake up? I kind of think that's probably how Jesus woke up. I don't know. The text doesn't say. Sometimes you wake up. When I was working as the night operator, I answered phones in the middle of the night. I would have to be in bed asleep, all right? And it was a great job, by the way. I get paid literally to sleep is what I did. But if the phone ever rang, and it wasn't often, but in the middle of the night, if the phone ever rang, I had to answer it. And let me tell you something. There was a big bell system that went off. When the phone rang, these bells went off to make sure I woke up to answer the phone. And let me tell you, I heard those bells. Bam! I was up, awake, knew what was going on. It was, here you are, still a little draggy, but you know what was going on. But in this case, Jesus has been exhausted. I mean, if he's this sleepy and he wakes up, I kind of wonder if he's out of it. I kind of wonder if he's still yawning and still stretching, wiping the sleep out of his eyes, trying to stretch a little bit. And I don't know if he can kind of hear these disciples yelling at him, but they're in panic mode and they're all saying different things at him and yelling at him different things. And I got 3 kids, and sometimes they all come running up yelling at me, and I can't discern one of them, and there's 3 of them, and I can imagine there being 12 disciples, and they're all yelling at Jesus at the same time, and he's trying to wake up. I can just imagine the chaos of the whole scene. And it says he arose. And at some point after he arose, it says he rebuked the wind. And I love that expression. I'll tell you why. That word rebuke is a word that's used in Mark 2 other times up to this point to talk about Jesus' interaction with demonic forces. You can read it, I think, in Mark chapter 1, and maybe it's in chapter 3 as well, but twice it uses that word, literally in the Greek, to refer to when Jesus speaks to demons, and he commands them to come out of men. You say, well, why is it in this phrase here? Because, folks, I'd like to suggest to you that what Jesus is facing and dealing with isn't just something on the physical realm, there's something spiritual going on here. In other words, Jesus knew, I do believe, the storm would come up. But what the disciples did not know was that there were demonic forces attempting to drown Jesus and drown that boat. And folks, it reminds me that what we are facing in life is not just the physical realm. it reminds me there is a spiritual dimension and there is a spiritual warfare that takes place. And I'm telling you right now, much of what we face, and I don't think you should ever forget this, and I don't want to make you creeped out, or I don't want you sounding, cautious, but I do believe much of what you face in life is, seriously, folks, there is a spiritual dimension to much of that. If Jesus were able to pull back the curtain for you and open your eyes, I think you would be shocked to see how much of the spiritual realm is influencing what you face in life. I am completely convinced of that. And in this case, I think Jesus is giving us a little picture. To the disciples' mind, all it is the winds and the storms. To Jesus, he speaks as if there's something spiritual taking place. And in this case, folks, he says into the wind, "Peace, be still." Commands it. I don't know what kind of voice he used. I sometimes wonder if it was more of a shout. I wonder if he spoke with a very simple, "Peace, be still," and was very quiet about it. I think that would have been more dramatic than shouting out, "Peace, be still." Just, "Peace, be still." And folks, what happened was shocking. What happened is that the wind ceased and there was a great calm. You say, okay, so the wind stopped. I mean, they're still in the boat rocking back and forth. No, folks, the other text explained clearly that the winds were just like a piece of glass, or the waves were like a piece of glass. Can you imagine witnessing that? I mean, when a storm blows through, the wind continues to move a little bit, the breeze is there, the limbs and the trees keep moving a little bit. No, everything was perfectly still. I can only imagine the shock that would have been to the disciples. And folks, I'd like to suggest to you that this is the Savior we serve. This is the Savior we serve. This is the God who truly does care. And yes, he does let you get into those periods of time when it's literal storms around you, sometimes literal storms, metaphorical storms, whatever it is. God puts you in those situations, and he does so you can see more of your heart, so you can see what is literally coming out of your life. Are you going to trust Jesus, or are you going to panic like the disciples panicked? So often our default is to panic. And I understand that because I'm as frail and fleshly as you are. I have those moments as well. I get it. But folks, Jesus puts us in those situations because he wants us to look at him. The disciples, by the way, did the right thing. They went to Jesus. All right? They didn't quite go in the right attitude, perhaps, with as much faith as they should, but they did go to Jesus. They went to the one person they knew would work and could do something in this situation. By the way, they had never seen Jesus deal with a situation like this. Never had. They'd seen him cast out demons, they had seen him heal diseases, but they'd never seen him do something on this huge, magnificent scale of actually dealing with the forces of nature. Say, why did they go to him at this time? Well, he was their only solution. They had no other choice. They had nowhere to turn. By the way, God does that to you as well. He puts you in places where you have nowhere to turn. And he says, now who are you going to turn to? Well, you say, well, there's only one person. I have to turn to God. That's the point. He wants you to turn to him. By the way, I think this is beautiful. If you were to read, I'm not going to have you turn there this morning, but if you were to read Psalm 107, it'll talk about the stilling of the storms, and it says, the Lord Jehovah is the God who stills the storms. And then when you get to the New Testament and you read and see Jesus doing that, what conclusion are you supposed to draw about Jesus? He is Jehovah God. This is who this person is. And so he stills the storm, and there was a great calm. And then he turns to the disciples, verse 40, and he asks these questions. I love this. Why are you so fearful? What do you think the disciples thought when Jesus asked the question? Now, in our Bible, those two questions that he asked here, just one after another. I really wonder if Jesus didn't pause when he asked the first question. Why are you so fearful? Pause. 10 seconds, 15 seconds, while they process that question. If you were Peter, how would you process that question? Really, if you were Peter, Andrew, any of them, how would you process? Why are you so fearful? Come on, don't be more spiritual than anybody else here. How would you answer the question?
Well, the next you throw out, I'm not trusting in the Lord like me.
Okay, that's where he's going with the answer. That's true. Daniel?
Because I'm in the here and now around the physical world, I'm not really looking at the spiritual.
Okay. Y'all are being much more spiritual this morning than I want you to be. Well, how really? If you were Peter, how would you answer that question? Why are you so fearful?
Fear for the life.
Yeah, I would want to go. I mean, I was just accusing Jesus of not caring, so at this point I'd probably be saying, Jesus, didn't you just see what was going on? I mean, what do you mean, why are we so fearful? We were about to die, Jesus. It reminds me of the story I heard when I was in college. Jim Berg, some of you know him, Dr. Berg. He was dean of students for many years at Bob Jones. When he was earlier in his career, he used to take out ministry teams from Bob Jones to different churches, and I forget where they were. I don't know if it was out west, but they had a van of students. I think it was like 2 guys and 2 girls. It was he and his wife, and they travel and they preach and sing and so forth. And they were on the interstate somewhere, and they were in a busy traffic, as I recall the story. And as they were going down the interstate, there was a big truck. I don't know if it was a semi or what, came over into their lane, and they had to quickly get over into the median of the road. And there was a little, how they have these concrete barriers up, and so they were almost squished between the semi and the concrete barriers. They're trying to avoid it, and all the students in the back started screaming, and they're just screaming to the top of their lungs because they thought it's over, we're dying, bad accident. And he got off the side of the road, he got the van stopped, and the semi went on, and nothing happened. And he turned around and he told the students, he said, "Listen, new rule in the van: nobody screams until the driver screams." He said, "Now, when the driver screams, it's okay. You can scream, but nobody's allowed to scream until the driver screams." Well, folks, Jesus isn't screaming in the boat, but he's asking the question, why are you fearful? Why are you screaming? Why? Because they thought they were going to lose their life. And I'm sure they thought Jesus was out of his mind at first time asking the question even. But then he asked the second question. How is it that you have no faith? Why are you faithless? And folks, that's where the dagger hits. Oh, yeah, I guess I have been responding faithlessly. I guess my confidence really hasn't been in the Lord. I guess I wasn't really resting in the Lord through this storm as well. And it says in verse 41, and they feared exceedingly. I love that. Why are you afraid? And then it turns around and it said they feared exceedingly. Almost as if Jesus said, don't be afraid, but then their response is to be afraid. Why? Because they were looking now at the power of this man in the boat with them. What manner of man is this that even the wind and the sea obey him? Folks, they were more terrified of Jesus at this moment than they were of the storm. They were more terrified of Jesus than they were of losing their life at this moment. That's how terrified they were. And I like to suggest, folks, that spirit should also inculcate our hearts. That there should be this holy, reverent fear of Jesus. Because, folks, he is more powerful than anything you will face in this life. Now, he, thankfully, by his love, responds to you with great mercy in your life. So there's no reason to have this cowering fear. But, folks, there should be in our hearts such a fear of Jesus because of his power and his ability to work in our life that there is nothing in this life that should disturb us, even if it threatens to kill us. Why? Because we have such a rest and a confidence in this Jesus. We do, or we should. We have such a rest and a confidence in this Jesus. In fact, Angie just came through a while ago. Angie's had a hard week. Some of you know she's been a little sick, been taking some medicine, and she just laughed and she said, if the medicine doesn't kill me, maybe I'll get over what I've been dealing with. And I said, if the medicine kills you, it'll just be all much better. You'll be at home in heaven, whatever. For us, for a Christian, that's really the perspective. We get put in places in life. We don't like it. I understand it's hard, and there's things that we don't, it challenges us. But let me tell you, even if it kills us, we have such confidence in God that there's no reason to fear it because we're going to be with him, and it's going to be fine. In fact, I'll close with this story, but I had a coworker named Chuck Sebus who he used to laugh when people were facing hard things in life and give a prayer request about difficult things, and he would like to repeat one of the things his pastor, I believe it was his pastor, used to tell to him. He said, well, what you do, he said, you should cheer up, because one day we'll all be dead. And he'd raise his hands up with a big smile. He said, cheer up, one day we'll all be dead. As if that's good news. And for a Christian, that's actually good news. Why? Because we got a God who's so powerful, he can even calm the storms. And folks, if he can calm the storm like that, he can see us safely home to glory. So this is a challenge. This is the passage that challenges us
to keep our eyes on Jesus, even in the midst of the storms, and let our faith grow and be strengthened and have a fresh confidence and rest in Him. All right? Let's close in prayer.